I picked up that quite a lot of people think that this is the sort of the economy session of the weekend. So I think I'd better, for poor or better, disabuse you of that and reset your expectations. This is not a discussion. I'm not talking about tariff wars. I'm not talking about the economics of Brexit, or as I would say, the non-economics of Brexit. I'm not going to be talking about creative destruction, or anything like that. What I am going to try to do is to outline the development in the history of certain ideas over the course of the 20th century, primarily, which are ideas which I think are underpinning some of the key globalist institutions today, the World Trade Organization, European Union, of course. And I'm going to try and do that from a perspective of what I think pertains to the themes of the weekend of sovereignty and of democracy. Now, back about 10 years ago, back in 2007, just as Barack Obama was getting his presidential election campaign underway, Alan Greenspan, who was then the recently retired chairman of the US Federal Reserve, he was asked a question by a Swiss newspaper. Who would be the next president of the United States? And he replied, "We're fortunate that thanks to globalization, policy decisions in the US have been largely replaced by global market forces. It hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. The world is governed by market forces." Now, my thesis this morning is that this fairly standard and for Greenspan quite pithy summary of globalist thinking, that the belittling of democracy within that is not an incidental feature, but I think has been an ever-present feature of globalist thinking since its origins in the 20s and the 30s. Initially, though, although we all know what globalization is, and this isn't a discussion about globalization, but if you're not familiar with the more specific terms globalism and globalist, what is globalism? What are they? Now, some will describe the globalists as, and I think somebody did this yesterday, as the Davos crowd. You know, good starting point. But to me, the globalists are much broader than that. As well as all the people who run the various international institutions, the WTO, the International Monetary Fund, European Union, and so on, I think very importantly, and I stress this, it includes people running most of the West's national institutions too, such as things like the central banks, which obviously Alan Greenspan had been running in the United States. Globalism, I think, therefore describes pretty much the dominant perspective of the post-war Western political and business establishment. And its core feature, which I want to come back to in my talk, is its attachment to rules. In fact, in one phrase, I think the defining globalist ethos is its devotion to a world of rules. Hence all the talk today about Trump's policies being an attack on the rules-based international order, or his tariffs being an attack on the rules-based trade system, or the European Union's response, or the Commission's response to that sort of the British government's white paper, the cringing white paper of last week, when they said that they don't go far enough, the British government, because they go against the single market's foundational rule of the indivisibility of the famous four freedoms of movement of goods, services, capital, and people. Now, this affinity to rules is the reason why I'd say some very illiberal globalists claim to be liberal. Not because they fight for freedom and liberty every day, but because they define liberalism primarily as the rule of law. Francis Fukuyama put it recently when he was saying, he was trying to sum up what liberalism means for him, when he says that liberalism means having generally accepted rules that put clear limits on the way that the nation-state can exercise power. Now, I should just stress here that being devoted to rules, I've used that term devotion, being devoted to rules does not mean that as a globalist you always follow the rules. I think that's quite important. You don't necessarily adhere to them. I mean, Dominic gave the example last night in the session in Italy, reminded us that some very globalist governments, Germany, France, have consistently or fairly frequently broken a very important EU fiscal deficit rule. They spend more than 3% have a higher budget deficit of 3%. So globalists will when it serves their national interest, they will break the rules. But that does not negate that sort of affinity to rules is, I think, a sort of a defining feature. So going back to the globalist attachment to rules, I think it really came to the fore from the late stages of the Second World War, when the elites, not surprisingly, were, and we've discussed this a bit yesterday or come up in a couple of sessions, not surprisingly, they were preoccupied with avoiding a repetition of the conflicts of the previous 30 years. But their starting point, which is something that Frank described in detail yesterday, their starting point was their distrust of nationalism, their association of nationalism, time with fascism, aggression, violence, and also their assumption that people are easy prey, as the German people show themselves to be, that people are easy prey to nationalist anti-foreign sentiments. And I think this led the globalists to look not to politics and to reason to secure and maintain peace, but to rely on rules to regulate and control the relations between countries as well as relations within them. Now, of course, the United States, which was then the undisputed leading power of the world, led this approach, this rules-based approach. And it had an added justification for it, for a rules-based world order, because that would enable it to better keep control in a world when the old forms of direct domination of empires and colonialism were a thing of the past. But I would stress significantly that this rules-based order was accepted by all the leading countries at the time, including the emerging leadership in Germany. They all saw that this was what was necessary to prevent a return to interwar rivalry and conflict. Just to bring the discussion up before I go back again, but I think more recently, particularly as memories of the war, memories of empire and so on have faded, I think another very characteristic justification for rule following has become very common from globalists, which is the concept of complexity. The world, the globalists contend, is just far too complex to rely on national elites, never mind to rely on ordinary people, to be able to ensure international order and stability. The rules are needed now to set conditions, to set limits on how the nations act in this supposedly unusually complex time. As the globalist political commentator Gideon Rachman recently wrote, when he was describing a problem, he said, with what he calls contemporary nationalists, and for that he means everyone he doesn't agree with, is that they ignore the complexity of the modern world. And he went on and said, if we were to abolish all those fussy international rules and laws, then we are, quote, on the route to anarchy, to a trade war, or to a real war. So in this very complex world today, we're told that we need these rules. They stand between us and catastrophe of war. Going back to Greenspan's statement, I think 3 points I'd draw out from it. Firstly, I think it very well sums up the fatalist ethos of globalism. It hardly makes any difference who will be the next president. The world is governed by market forces. And the implication there is the standard globalist one, that nation states don't control anything now. So in a sense, why even bother to vote? It doesn't matter who's president. So I think that draws out the fact that today everything is supposedly determined by those market forces, by the market. We're in a very deterministic type of world. Secondly, I think there's an added significance of this statement because of who made it. Because remember, until his retirement a few months earlier, Greenspan had been regularly feted on the front of Time magazine, every other magazine, as the most powerful man in the world. And I think we should note the irony there, that there's the former leader of the world's most powerful central bank is highlighting the powerlessness in the face of globalization. And I think that counterposition between the establishment's levers of real power and the claim of powerlessness is not an incidental paradox of globalism, but I think is intrinsic to it. And thirdly, the third point is Greenspan's Central European heritage, because I think that's not unimportant to the history of neoliberalism and globalism. Now, even in Greenspan's case, in his case, he was a second-generation exponent of this. He was actually born in New York in the 1920s, and he lived first in the Washington Heights district, which was then known as Frankfurt on the Hudson, because of the very large number of Jewish immigrants who had moved there from Germany. Now, Greenspan's parents were actually of Central European descent. His father was Romanian, his mother was Hungarian. But my point here is that although we often associate neoliberal globalism with the Anglo-American world, with the Chicago School, with Reagan and Thatcher and their policies from the 80s, its intellectual heritage is much more Central European than it is American or British. It's not a coincidence that almost all the early intellectual leaders of neoliberalism were from Central or Eastern Europe. Karl Menger, the founder of the Austrian school, he was born in present-day Poland. Ludwig von Mises was Ukrainian, and Friedrich Hayek himself was, of course, born in Vienna. And I'll return to their influence on the development of globalist thinking in a couple of minutes. Now, two narratives about globalism, I think, can be read into Greenspan's answer. The standard, the most popular narrative is of globalism as the twin of neoliberalism, expressing the market fundamentalist view, state intervention is bad for the economy, the government interferes too much with the self-regulating power of free markets, and therefore it undermines prosperity. I think this probably explains why Greenspan regarded it as fortunate, as he said. It's fortunate that globalization has rendered the government as redundant. So I'll call this the anti-state narrative. I think an alternative narrative is much more pertinent, and I'm going to call it sort of the anti-politics, and specifically the anti-mass politics narrative. Because Greenspan's statement, I think, incorporates the presumption that we've reached, not a new idea, reached the end of politics. Politics has lost its efficacy in the face of global forces. Policies, especially economic policies, are now pretty irrelevant, is what this assumes. Everything is driven, everything is determined by the impersonal force of globalization. This sort of anti-politics narrative was summarized very well, I think, by the American historian Quinn Slobodian. And Slobodian, if you're interested, is also an Eastern European name, but he's Ukrainian, although he is very critical of globalism, I should say. Anyway, he made the point that globalism is the belief that politics has moved to the passive tense. I think that sums it up very well. And he argues that the only actor remaining for the globalists was the global economy. And so it's a narrative, an anti-politics narrative, therefore, embodies that fatalist sense of a denial or a myth of agency. Now, my argument is that the standard anti-state narrative is misleading, because globalists are not really anti-state at all. Globalists, within their various national, international state institutions, they don't go to work in the morning with their anti-state hat on. They don't sort of go in there, put their feet up and say, oh, great, another free day because I don't want to do anything. I don't want to do any state activity. They are very, very active in their roles within those institutions. Even the overtly self-labeled neoliberals among them, who we know they will openly denounce planning and they'll openly denounce the state control of business and so on, they're not against state activism as such. Hayek, for example, in his 1979 book, Law, Legislation and Liberty, explicitly rejected what he thought was the unfounded charge against him of mischaracterizing him as a minimal statist. And he went on to say, I'm not a minimal statist, he argued. He said, this is right, the end of the 70s, it is unquestionable, he said, that in an advanced society, government ought to use its power of raising funds by taxation to provide a number of services which for various reasons cannot be provided or cannot be provided adequately by the market. So, denying that he was a minimal status very clearly. And so when globalists say or allude to being anti-state, I think what they're really expressing is their opposition to the nation state rather than to state intervention per se. And more than that, when they're critical of the nation state, they're not really even, and this might be more controversial, they're not really even against the nation as an existing entity. What they're most against is the ideas of nationhood and the ideas of nationalism, which they identify with ordinary people of a particular bounded territory. So I think it's their concern about democracy, and as this today only exists, as we've discussed at length yesterday, only exists in the national form, this is what informs and drives their belittling of the nation state. It's therefore, I argue, misleading a caricature to claim that all globalists seek a borderless world or a zero-state society. You know, you will find a few of them do. But what really unites them all is, I think, their yearning for a world which is insulated from popular democracy, insulated from accountability. Now, just to say a bit more about the intellectual origins of this thinking. Now, if you have a presumption about neoliberalism that it's to do with the economy and economics, and I must hold my hand up, you know, in the past I have had that one-sided view, neoliberalism, and I'm talking, I should stress, I'm talking here about classical neoliberalism. I'm not talking about the way neoliberalism is discussed today as a sort of superficial swear word, you know, anything you don't like, neoliberal, you know, public-private partnerships, neoliberal rubbish, you know, rising house prices, oh, that's neoliberal. Falling house prices, oh, it's the neoliberals are hot weather, neoliberal. Now, I'm not talking about that sort of neoliberalism, but classic neoliberalism, I often thought was about the economy and economics. But we should put that to one side if that's the view that you also hold, because it's much more about politics. I think classic neoliberalism from the 20s and 30s emerged partly as out of a critique of the spread of national sovereignty, coming out of that, you know, the malaise or the melee of the post-First World War disillusion of all the empires, you know, the Ottoman Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Russian, German, and so on. The people who later would call themselves the neoliberals, the Hayeks and so on, they were hostile to national sovereignty as getting in the way, they said, of, quote, universal economic freedoms. And they favoured an alternative to national sovereignty coming out of empires of some mix of world government with individual consumer sovereignty. So you have the world, you have the individual, but not the nations in between. For example, many of them who were involved setting up the famous neoliberal Mount Pelerin Society in 1947, not least von Mises and Hayek, they had been brought up, in fact, I think von Mises was trained to serve the now, what was then deceased, Austro-Hungarian Empire. And they were unhappy with this dissolution of that empire, and they came to promote it, to promote the old empire, alongside promoting another failed institution, which was the interwar League of Nations. They came to promote them as being good models for international federation, as a way, they said, of ensuring economic unity across countries and securing the benefit of a wider division of labour. Neoliberals favoured such supranational state intervention then to preserve and secure their private property-based, the private property-based capitalist order. And towards the end of the Second World War, von Mises suggested reforming the League of Nations as an international government that could ensure what he summarised as the free movement of goods, services, capital, and people. So you now know one of the sources of the EU's famous four freedoms is von Mises. Now, while von Mises undoubtedly believed in the Smithian invisible hand of the market, he also thought, I would say, that he needed an iron glove, you know, through a supranational state in order to protect that invisible hand. Von Mises, Hayek, the other neoliberals, like Lionel Robbins, they were realistic, though, that nation states, were not just going to disappear. They were disappointed at the end of empire, but they knew the nation state wasn't just going to disappear. So they proposed what they sometimes called double government, by which there would be both national and supranational states. What they called cultural issues would still be managed at the national level, while the running of the economy, the important things, that would be separated and pursued at a world level. And this double government was for them a way to institutionalize the separation of politics from economics, to detach the rule of nation states from the rule of capital and property, a division between what they called imperium, to do with the rule of people, and dominium, to do with the rule of things. Their aspiration was that the economy would be permanently depoliticized through this arrangement, in the sense of being freed from the interference of politics and of people, and instead overseen by this supranational state. So I hope you can see that these interwar ideas of the neoliberals therefore anticipated some of the post-Second World War economic framework, the IMF, General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the EU. Although we should note that when these institutions were set up in 1944 and 1947 and so on, many neoliberals thought that they were flawed because they didn't go far enough in taking economic power away from the national level. And the same neoliberal globalist ideas also anticipated the subsequent depoliticization of economic policy with which we have become so familiar, especially since the 1980s, that outsourcing of policy to various unaccountable bodies, the independent central banks, and of course to the European Union. Moving forward to the post-war realization, if only partially, the post-war realization of these neoliberal ideas, their fruition, I would say, was underpinned by three profound concerns, each of which go back to those harrowing experiences of the first half of the 20th century. And of course, experiences where were much more directly felt in Central Europe, in what had been German-occupied, war-torn Central Europe than just about anywhere else. First concern was about the return of fascism, international conflict, ultimately, the prospect of another world war. Second concern were worries about the collapse of the economic system, as had so nearly occurred in the 1930s slump. And the third was the fear of the power of the masses, of people taking matters into their own hands, which is a fear which had been ratcheted up, of course, ever since the Russian Revolution. And I think it's the fusion of those three anxieties which helps explain the translation of those neoliberal ideas into the globalist policies and behaviors throughout the whole post-1945 times. Now, the immediate worry then was of international conflict. Unsurprising that the actual term globalism was only first emerged during and immediately after the experiences of the Second World War. It was basically a Second World War term. And its most pressing impulse was to prevent, say, the recurrence of war between nations. It seemed clear to the post-war elites that simply reintroducing some loose League of Nations type grouping would not be sufficient to preserve peace. So instinctively, they took the technocratic route of adopting rules and institutional systems to try to cement international cooperation. Hence the priority the new globalists gave, even as the bloodbath was carrying on in Asia and Europe. In 1944, famous Bretton Woods conference, where the international monetary system was set up, regulating currency rates, setting up those institutions, the IMF and the World Bank. And I think it's significant. GATT, the Tariffs and Trade Agreement, or Trade and Tariffs Agreement, which was set up a couple of years later, worth stressing its very first founding article, in terms of what was the genesis of the thinking behind it, its very first founding article prohibited the sort of discriminatory trade policies that in the 1930s had seemed to them to have reinforced inter-imperialist conflict. Now, how effective those young institutions would have been on their own is a moot point, but the outbreak of the Cold War acted both to contain inter-imperialist conflict for many decades, and through that gave these institutions time to establish themselves as the bedrock of the post-war economic infrastructure. I think informed also by the Nuremberg trials, this post-war trajectory promoted specifically the role of international judicial bodies, especially in the economic arena, which could override national legislation if it got in the way of the requirements of capital. This juridification of international economic relations led to various supranational legal bodies. Obviously, we're very familiar with the European Court of Justice. But I think it also probably later it informed the transformation in the mid-90s, 1995, of GATT into a much more rule-based World Trade Organization, with its dispute settlement body, its appellate body, and so on. The globalist belief in such institutional policing of rules as necessary to prevent war led not just to the precursor of the European Union, the European Coal and Steel Community, which was in 1952, but more widely it justified supranational bodies making decisions that could overrule national sovereignty. So that's the first concern, how to prevent that conflict re-breaking out. Second concern, the worry of capitalist breakdown. Now, the slump of the 30s, I would stress, shook Friedrich Hayek and his Austrian school colleagues just as severely as it shook John Maynard Keynes and the more mainstream thinkers that went along with him. Hayek and Keynes were simply adopted different routes in their ideas about how to save capitalism. And I think significantly, the routes that they chose were actually not that different as is conventionally made out to be. And I think that's illustrated by the proceedings of the famous Walter Lippmann colloquium, which took place in Paris in 1938. That's the get-together where von Mises and Hayek and others present actually chose the label for their ideas of neoliberalism. That's when they call themselves neoliberals. Because proceedings at that colloquium incorporated the same thinking that was expressed by Keynes and his general theory in rejecting, both of them did, Keynes and Hayek's side, both rejected 19th century laissez-faire ideals. They were united not in trying to limit the state, but they both saw that the state needed to be rethought. The type of state necessary had to be thought through again, necessary for safeguarding the market from collapse. Now, most people at the colloquium recognized that the self-regulating market was a myth. There were a few individuals who stood out from that, but most recognized that was a myth, that the idea of self-correcting capitalism just didn't work. So the economy needed support from the state. So endorsing an economic role for the state beyond that of the metaphorical night watchman was therefore part of neoliberal thinking right from its very early days, right from its formative days. And I would say, going back to the standard fiction, the standard narrative fiction, the idea which is still very firmly held today, that globalist neoliberalism is anti-state, I think that derives partly from the critique at the same colloquium of what was called the illusion of control. It's quite important to neoliberal thinking. While the neoliberals wanted the state to preserve capitalism, they vehemently rejected state socialist policies because they saw these as, quote, overhead control of the economy and overhead control by, quote, intelligent authority. And they repudiated both those ideas as being naive and economically damaging. Instead, as we're probably more familiar with, the neoliberals saw the economy as driven by millions of individual responses to prices, so that it was far too complex for any economist or any central authority to be able to fully capture, comprehend, and therefore control. As an aside, I mentioned complexity earlier, but as an aside, I would flag up that emphasis of complexity of the neoliberals even before 1939, because I think that offers a useful riposte to contemporary globalists who claim that it's the contemporary complexity of the world is a very novel thing resulting from our very fast-moving, globalized world. And it's this novel turn of events of complexity which necessitates that we have to rethink democracy today, because democracy could only work in those simpler times before we had globalization. But we can see complexity is there as an idea right from the 30s. And returning to the 30s, the conclusion that the neoliberals drew was that although the economy is too complex to be controlled, it could at least be ordered. Not just to cement international cooperation, but to curb the destabilizing tendencies of capitalism to prevent a recurrence of the 1930s and the prospect of capitalist breakdown. Hence again, their yearning for rules to encase capitalism. They argued that in order for the market to be able to exert its discipline, it needed to be protected by what they called an extra economic framework, which they spelt out in the form of a legal constitutional regulatory framing. The German version of neoliberalism, which in 1950 was renamed ordoliberalism, was probably the most explicit in spelling out the state's heavy responsibilities. Ordoliberalism's founder, Walter Eucken, I think is the close enough to the for the Germans here, Walter Eucken, who's from the Freiburg School, he called explicitly for a strong state to be able to stand above the interests of lobbies. And in the same spirit, Lars Feld, who's the current director of the Walter Eucken Institute, which was set up, Walter Eucken died in 1950, I think, so this institute, this think tank, free market think tank, or or ordoliberal think tank set up in the mid-1950s, its current director, Feld, describes what he calls classic neoliberalism as the government providing a rules-based, constitutional, legal framework to shape markets, while then cautioning that government shouldn't intervene in the day-to-day economic decisions. And Feld describes the state as, quote, the concentrated force of the system of liberty. I think Hayek, well, that's sort of the extreme end, Hayek himself pursued the same approach in arguing for global institutions to safeguard capitalism, including protecting what he called the negative right for foreign investments to have freedom from expropriation, and also the right to move capital freely across borders. And hence the welcome that many neoliberals gave to the European Economic and Monetary Union and to the independent European Central Bank as well, as constituting what they called an economic constitution for Europe. And in a similar vein, some neoliberals also support those controversial investor-state provisions in recent megatrade arrangements, which give businesses operating in foreign territories legal rights over the host nation-state, something that's called international, or they euphemistically call international investor protection. Okay, so that's on the relation to capitalist breakdown. The third, final motivating concern behind globalism is their distrust of the masses. Neoliberal globalists like Hayek emphasized their differences with Keynesianism in debates which followed were not because they were opposed to state intervention, but because they associated Keynesian state policies and the subsequent whole post-war mixed economy as a variant of the state socialism that they hated so much. Far from denying state activism in general and in principle, they were much more concerned about the influence of Marxism, after the Russian Revolution and so on, far more concerned about the Soviet Union, and later concerned about the National Socialist fascism many of them had fled from. So it was their objection to these forms of state control that reinforced, I think, their skepticism about democracy, and for some, I think, stoked their outright hostility to mass democracy. One influential post-war globalist, another East European, a Czech, Jan Tumler, and he was a lawyer and also the chief economist at the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs. He was there for 20 years, from the mid-60s to 1987. And he explained in 1983 that when you have democracy, the masses can capture the state. Bit of a hazard of democracy. And the state, quote, ceases to be a government and it becomes an arena for gladiatorial combats of organized interests. Right? This is one of the leaders of GATT explaining this while he's still in post. The risk with democracy, he concluded, is that by its own logic, it can lead to socialism. And he laconically summed up this rationale for a rules-based systems, both GATT and similar ones, by saying international rules protect the world market against governments. So rules don't only put shackles on governments, I would argue they also, and I think this underpins his thinking as well, they also justify a refusal to engage in political debate with people, with the demos. Rules, the idea of rules are used to back up the insistence on TINA, on there being no alternative. The argument is there's no value in having, open discussion about alternatives because we have the rules to follow. So the rules themselves, they're is a way of enforcing that idea. There is no alternative and therefore no point for a political debate. It's not coincidental, I think, that Hayek's rejection of minimal statism, you say, he was appalled that somebody was calling him a minimal status. His rejection of that in 1979 was in a book, the book I mentioned earlier on law and legislation and liberty. It was a book which explicitly critiqued democracy. And specifically what Hayek called the, quote, unlimited, unrestrained representative government. Unlimited, unrestrained representative democracy, in fact. Which he thought, and he explained, bound to lead to stupid and damaging economic policies. Because remember, his whole idea is, we can't possibly comprehend the world, we can't control it, only the market does. So it's bound to have damaging consequences. And this conclusion rested on this denial of economic control, which led to his other denial, I think, which is that people, therefore, cannot be masters of their fate. He, like other neoliberal globalists, determined that restricting political freedoms, therefore, restricting democracy, restricting democratic rights, was sometimes necessary in order to preserve economic freedom. I think this type of thinking shows again that the globalist skepticism about the nation state is in a very big part driven by anxieties over its democratic base or its potential democratic base, over its mass political aspects. It's concern about this nation state as a mechanism for democratic power. The globalist denial of the effectiveness of national state policies is mostly a denial of the acceptance of democratic politics. The attack on nationalism, on sovereignty, is, I think, really an attack on that Hayekian concept of the unlimited power, potential power of the people. And in the end, then I'd say that complementing their fears of international conflict, their fears of economic breakdown, what worries globalists most on a day-to-day level is popular democracy, the potential of people intruding into their technocratic practices and procedures. So to conclude then, I think motivated by these three post-war concerns, international conflict, capitalist collapse, distrust of the people, the globalists are entirely pragmatic and often fervent about using state institutions to maintain and stabilize capitalist economic relations. Globalists are happy running not just international institutions, but national ones too, no aversion to that, but as long as they are free as possible from democratic accountability. This is one reason, I think, why throughout his life, Hayek and other neoliberal globalists put increasing faith in the law, both national and supranational, because for them the expansion of democracy around the world was corroding that foundational separation of economics from politics, which was so important to their outlook. Globalists and neoliberals still today, and I'm mused about this, it took me a bit slow thinker, me, but globalists and neoliberals are always saying, we're into the free market, we're into free trade. And I always think, can you not see, state expenditures, 45% of GDP and stuff? It's just crazy. How can you talk about this? But I've realized, late in my life, probably too late, that the freedom that really motivates them is not freedom from state intervention, not freedom from state spending. The freedom that really motivates them is from being answerable to the people. Their desire to protect capitalism from war, from breakdown, from popular intrusion. That's what it's about. And ultimately, from popular insurrection. That's what necessitates for them curbing the potentially disruptive effects of national democracy on market processes. So I think it's the synthesis, the fusion of those three fears accounts for this, my alternate narrative, the anti-political core of globalism. Neoliberal globalism is much more a political project, as I indicated, than it is an economic one. I think that's very important. In that sense, Hayek's, I think, most important contribution to globalism was not his romantic attachment to the 19th century free market, but was his arguments about what he called the dethronement of politics. The irony, though, as we're ending, is that the neoliberal pursuit of depoliticizing the economy, dethroning politics, is itself a political program, because it's expressed ultimately in trying to shield capitalism from democratic influences. As early as 1932, Walter Eucken, remember the founder of German neo-liberalism, German ordo-liberalism, he had openly denounced what he called the democratization of the world. So again, it was there right at the beginning, referring to the masses coming into politics via universal, if mostly male, suffrage. You know, this was a terrible thing, this democratization of the world. And almost exactly 50 years later, in 1981, after visiting Pinochet's Chile, Hayek was equally explicit as Walter Eucken had been a half-century before about his contempt for democracy. He told a Chilean newspaper that he was, as long-term institutions, totally against dictatorships. You knew that, you knew that was coming. But at times, it is necessary for a country to have, for a time, some form of dictatorial power. Personally, I prefer a liberal dictator to democratic government lacking liberalism.
Okay.